In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, few names inspire such reverence and awe as that of Sanguinius, the great Angel of Baal. Among the 20 Primarchs created by the Emperor of mankind, none possessed such perfect beauty, such tragic nobility, or carried such a burden of destiny upon their shoulders. His story is one of sacrifice and glory, of an angel who fell not to corruption, but to love for his father and his people. Tonight we journey to the crimson world of Baal, where beneath twin suns and among the irradiated wastes, a legend was born. We will witness the rise of the most beloved of all the Emperor's sons, whose very presence could calm the savage hearts of his gene sons, and whose death would echo through 10 millennia of imperial history. This is the tale of Sanguinius, the Angel of Baal, whose golden wings carried hope through the darkest of times. The tale begins not in the golden halls of Terra, but in the deepest laboratories beneath the Himalayan peaks, where the Emperor of mankind laboured over his greatest work. Using his own genetic template as the foundation, the Master of Humanity crafted 20 perfect beings, each designed to embody different aspects of his own divine nature. These would be his sons, his generals, his heirs to the galaxy itself. Yet the dark gods of chaos, ever watchful for opportunities to thwart the Emperor's grand design, struck at the moment of the Primarchs' creation. Through sorcery and malice, they scattered the infant demigods across the galaxy, casting them into the void like seeds upon a cosmic wind. Each Primarch fell to a different world, their incubation pods carrying them far from their father's sight. One such pod descended through the burning atmosphere of a world called Baal Secundus, crashing into the radioactive deserts that stretched endlessly beneath twin suns. This was no paradise world, no garden of civilization, where a godchild might grow in comfort and plenty. Baal Secundus was a wasteland, a monument to humanity's capacity for self-destruction, where the remnants of ancient wars had poisoned the very soil and turned the skies the colour of dried blood. The world had once been different. Archaeological evidence suggested that in ages past, Baal Secundus had been a thriving centre of human civilization, its cities gleaming beneath clear skies, its people reaching toward the stars with hope and ambition. But that golden age had ended in nuclear fire and chemical death, leaving behind only the scattered tribes of survivors who eked out a brutal existence among the ruins of their ancestors' glory. When the strange pod fell from the heavens, it was discovered by one such tribe, the people of the pure blood. These desert nomads, like all who dwelt upon Baal Secundus, had been changed by generations of exposure to radiation and toxins. Their bodies were pale and gaunt, their eyes adapted to the harsh light of their twin suns, their lifespans measured in mere decades rather than the centuries their ancestors had enjoyed. Yet when they cracked open the mysterious vessel, they found within it something that defied all their understanding. The infant they discovered was perfect in ways that seemed impossible in their blighted world. His skin was unmarked by radiation burns, his limbs strong and whole, his hair golden as the light of ancient Terra's sun. Most remarkable of all were the small wings that sprouted from his shoulders, white as fresh snow, marking him as something beyond mortal ken. The tribespeople might have killed the child, fearing him as some mutant aberration or demon spawn. In their harsh world, mercy was a luxury few could afford, and the strange was often synonymous with the deadly. Yet something about the infant stayed their hands. Perhaps it was the nobility that radiated from his tiny form, or the way he seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with radiation. Whatever the reason, they chose to raise him as one of their own. They named him Sanguinius, meaning of the blood in the ancient tongue of Terra, though they knew not why the name came to them. From his earliest days it was clear that this child was different from any who had walked beneath Baal's crimson skies. He grew with supernatural speed, his body developing at a rate that would have been alarming in any other infant. Yet there was nothing monstrous about his growth, Rather, each day he became more perfect, more beautiful, more obviously divine. His wings grew with him, developing from small stubs into magnificent appendages that caught the light like spun silver. By the time he could walk, he could also glide short distances, his young face alight with joy as he soared above the desert sands. The tribe watched in wonder and growing reverence as their foundling child displayed abilities that seemed drawn from their oldest legends. But it was not merely his physical perfection that set Sanguinius apart. Even as a child, he possessed a charisma that was almost supernatural in its power. When he spoke, others listened, compelled by something in his voice that spoke directly to their hearts. When he smiled, even the most hardened warriors found themselves remembering what it felt like to hope. There was a nobility about him that seemed to elevate all who came into his presence, reminding them that they were more than mere survivors, scratching out an existence in the ruins. As he grew to adolescence, Sanguinius began to display abilities that went far beyond the merely superhuman. His strength was immense, allowing him to lift boulders that would have challenged entire groups of grown men. His speed was such that he could outrun the fastest desert predators, his form becoming little more than a golden blur as he raced across the dunes. His reflexes were perfect, allowing him to snatch arrows from the air or dodge the strikes of the great scorpions that hunted in the radioactive nights. Yet perhaps most remarkable of all was his ability to inspire others. Under his leadership, the people of the pure blood began to change. They stopped merely surviving and began to thrive. Their raids against rival tribes became campaigns of conquest and unification. Their scattered camps grew into permanent settlements. Their ancient feuds gave way to alliances forged in the crucible of Sanguinius's vision. The young Primarch possessed an intuitive understanding of strategy and tactics that would have impressed even the greatest generals of ancient Terra. He could read the flow of battle like a scholar reads a text, positioning his forces with perfect precision and striking at his enemies' weaknesses with surgical accuracy. Yet he was no cold calculator of war. His battles were fought with passion and honour, and he treated even his defeated foes with a nobility that was rare in the harsh world of Baal Secundus. It was during these early campaigns that Sanguinius first encountered the creatures that would become both his greatest enemies and, in a sense, his dark reflection. The mutants of Baal Secundus were not merely the deformed descendants of radiation exposure. Some had been twisted into something far worse, their humanity replaced by an alien hunger that could never be satisfied. These creatures, known to the tribes as the blood drinkers, were vampiric monstrosities that fed upon the life essence of their victims. The first time Sanguinius faced such creatures in battle, something awakened within him that would shape the rest of his existence. As he fought against the blood drinkers, tearing them apart with his bare hands, while his wings carried him through the air like an avenging angel, he felt a strange resonance with their nature. It was as if some part of him recognized something of himself in these abominations, a kinship that both thrilled and horrified him. Yet rather than embrace this darkness, Sanguinius chose to fight against it. He made it his mission to hunt down and destroy every blood drinker on Baal Secundus, not out of hatred, but out of a deep understanding that such creatures represented a path he must never walk. In destroying them, he was destroying a part of himself, sacrificing his own darker nature for the good of those he had sworn to protect. Word of the golden-winged warrior spread across the radioactive wastes like wildfire. Tribe after tribe came to witness this miracle, this perfect being who fought like a god and spoke like a prophet. Some came as supplicants, begging to join his growing confederation. Others came as challengers, seeking to test their strength against this legendary figure. All left changed by the encounter, either as devoted followers or as defeated enemies who had learned to respect his power. As his influence grew, so too did the sophistication of his domain. The scattered camps of the pure blood tribe evolved into a network of fortified settlements connected by well-guarded trade routes. Ancient technologies were rediscovered and put to use, irrigation systems bringing life to barren lands, weapons and armor being forged in workshops that had not operated for centuries. Under Sanguinius's guidance, the people of Baal Secundus began to reclaim something of their lost heritage. Yet the young Primarch was not content merely to rule over a collection of desert tribes. His vision extended far beyond the borders of Baal Secundus, reaching toward the moons and planets that orbited the same crimson star. Baal Prime, the largest of these worlds, was home to more advanced civilizations that had maintained some semblance of the old technologies. It was toward these worlds that Sanguinius eventually turned his attention, knowing that true unification of the Baal system would require bringing all of its children under one banner. The campaigns that followed would become the stuff of legend among the people of Baal. Sanguinius led his growing armies not as a conqueror but as a liberator, offering the scattered human settlements a choice between voluntary integration and forcible annexation. Most chose the former, drawn by tales of the angel's justice and the prosperity that followed in his wake. Those few who chose to resist found themselves facing not just a superior military force, but a leader whose very presence seemed to sap their will to fight. It was during these campaigns that Sanguinius first began to display the psychic abilities that would later mark him as one of the most powerful psykers among the Primarchs. His precognitive gifts allowed him to anticipate his enemies' moves with uncanny accuracy, while his telepathic abilities enabled him to coordinate his forces with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. Yet perhaps most importantly, his empathic powers allowed him to sense the true nature of those around him, distinguishing between those who could be redeemed and those who had fallen too far into corruption to be saved. The unification of the Baal system was not achieved through conquest alone. Sanguinius proved himself to be as skilled a diplomat as he was a warrior, forging alliances through marriage, trade agreements, and shared cultural exchanges. He established courts of law that treated all citizens equally regardless of their tribal origins, created educational institutions that preserved and expanded upon ancient knowledge, and built temples that honoured not just the old gods of Baal, but the growing legend of the angel himself. Yet even as his earthly power grew, Sanguinius found himself plagued by visions that spoke of a greater destiny awaiting him among the stars. In his dreams, he saw a golden figure wreathed in light, a being of such immense power and nobility that even the Primarch felt humbled in his presence. He saw vast fleets of starships carrying warriors in armour of gold and crimson, spreading across the galaxy to bring order to chaos and light to darkness. Most disturbing of all, he saw his own death played out in vivid detail against the backdrop of a battle that would decide the fate of all humanity. These visions came to him with increasing frequency as he approached full maturity, their meaning becoming clearer with each repetition. He was not meant to rule only Baal. His destiny lay among the stars themselves, as part of a grand crusade that would reshape the galaxy. Yet the visions also showed him the price of that destiny, the sacrifice that would be demanded of him in service to a cause greater than any one world or system. As Sanguinius contemplated these prophetic dreams, he found himself torn between his love for the people of Baal and his growing certainty that his true purpose lay elsewhere. He had given these people hope, had lifted them from barbarism to civilization, had forged a realm of justice and prosperity from the ashes of their ancestors' failures. Could he abandon them to pursue a destiny among the stars? Could he remain when he knew that greater battles awaited him in the void between worlds? The answer would come not from his own deliberations, but from the stars themselves. For even as Sanguinius wrestled with questions of duty and destiny, a fleet of golden ships was approaching the Baal system, carrying with it the most powerful being in human history, and the father the Primarch had never known he possessed. The Emperor's arrival at Baal was heralded not by fanfare or grand proclamation, but by a subtle shift in the very fabric of reality itself. Those sensitive to the warp felt it first, a presence so vast and luminous that it seemed to eclipse the twin suns that had watched over the system for millennia. The psychers among Sanguinius's followers fell to their knees in spontaneous reverence, overwhelmed by a psychic radiance that spoke of divinity made manifest. Sanguinius himself felt the approach long before the Golden Fleet translated from warp space into the Baal system. Standing upon the highest tower of his palace, his magnificent wings spread wide to catch the crimson light of dawn, the Primarch gazed upward with eyes that saw far beyond the physical realm. He had been expecting this moment, had seen it countless times in his prophetic dreams, yet the reality of it still filled him with a mixture of anticipation and profound uncertainty. When the Imperial vessels finally appeared in the system's outer reaches, they came not as conquerors, but as liberators returning home. The fleet was vast beyond imagination, hundreds of ships ranging from sleek destroyers to massive battle barges, all bearing the golden aquila of the nascent Imperium. At their head sailed a vessel that dwarfed all others, a cathedral of adamantium and ceramite that pulsed with barely contained power, the flagship of the Emperor of Mankind himself. The inhabitants of Baal watched in awe as this celestial armada took position throughout their system. Some fell to their knees in worship, recognizing in these golden ships the fulfillment of ancient prophecies that spoke of deliverers who would come from beyond the stars. Others reached for weapons, their warrior instincts responding to what could only be an invasion force of unprecedented scale. But Sanguinius raised his hand, and his voice carried across every settlement and outpost in the system, speaking words of calm and welcome. For the Angel of Baal knew who commanded this fleet, had seen his face in 1,000 visions, had felt the pull of kinship across the vast gulfs of space and time. This was his father, his creator, the being who had shaped him in the deepest laboratories of Terra and whose genetic legacy flowed through every cell of his perfect form. The moment of reunion that he had both longed for and dreaded was finally at hand. The Emperor came to Baal not with armies or ultimatums, but alone, descending from the heavens in a simple shuttle that bore none of the ornamentation of his vast fleet. He walked the red sands of Baal Secundus as any traveller might, though the very ground seemed to sing with power beneath his feet. The radiation that had poisoned this world for centuries could not touch him. The toxic winds that had claimed countless lives parted before his passage, like curtains before a king. When father and son finally stood face to face upon the crystalline plain where Sanguinius's pod had first crashed to earth, the moment was one of perfect recognition. The Emperor gazed upon his 9th son and saw reflected there his own nobility, his own burden of leadership, his own willingness to sacrifice everything for the good of humanity. Sanguinius looked upon his father and understood at last the source of the visions that had haunted his dreams, the genetic imperative that had driven him to unite the scattered tribes of Baal under one banner. They spoke for hours in the shadow of the red cliffs, father and son sharing the stories of their separate journeys. The Emperor told of Terra's unification, of the great crusade that was even now spreading across the galaxy, of the 20 sons he had created to serve as generals in humanity's greatest war. Sanguinius spoke of Baal's transformation, of the battles against the mutant hordes, of the civilization he had built from the ashes of the old world's destruction. Yet beneath their words lay deeper currents of understanding. The Emperor recognized in Sanguinius something he had not found in his other recovered sons, a perfect synthesis of nobility and pragmatism, of warrior's strength and diplomat's wisdom. Here was a being who could inspire absolute devotion without resorting to fear, who could lead through example rather than compulsion. In the Angel of Baal, the master of mankind saw perhaps the truest reflection of his own highest aspirations. For his part, Sanguinius understood that his father carried burdens that went far beyond the conquest of a single world or even a single system. The emperor bore responsibility for the entire human species, for shepherding humanity through the darkness that surrounded them on all sides. The weight of such responsibility would have crushed any lesser being, yet the emperor carried it with a grace that spoke of strength beyond mortal comprehension. When their long conversation finally ended, the decision was never really in doubt. Sanguinius would join the Great Crusade, would take his place among his father's generals, and lead his own legion into the depths of space. Yet this was not abandonment of his people on Baal, it was their elevation to something greater. The system that Sanguinius had unified would become a recruiting world for the legion that would bear his genetic legacy, its hardy people transformed into the angels of death who would carry their Primarchs' nobility to the furthest reaches of the galaxy. The transition was not without its challenges. The people of Baal had known Sanguinius as their angel, their saviour, their god-king who had lifted them from barbarism to civilization. The thought of losing him to the wider galaxy filled many with despair, while others questioned whether any cause could be worthy of their beloved leader's attention. Yet Sanguinius possessed the rare gift of making others see beyond their own immediate concerns to the larger picture of human destiny. In great gatherings held across the Baal system, the angel addressed his people with words that would be remembered and recited for generations to come. He spoke of humanity's place among the stars, of the countless worlds where their brothers and sisters struggled against alien predators and the corrupting influence of the warp. He painted for them a vision of a galaxy united under the banner of human civilization, where the achievements of Baal would be multiplied 1,000-fold across countless systems. More importantly, he assured them that he was not abandoning them, but extending their influence beyond anything they had previously imagined. The sons of Baal would march alongside him as space marines, carrying their world's values of honor, nobility, and sacrifice to battlefields across the galaxy. Through the Blood Angels' Legion, the spirit of Baal would touch every corner of human space, becoming not merely a local phenomenon, but a galactic force for righteousness. The process of creating the Blood Angels' Legion began almost immediately upon the Emperor's arrival. The genetic laboratories aboard the Imperial fleet worked tirelessly to synthesize Sanguinius's genetic template into the gene seed that would transform worthy candidates into Space Marines. Yet this was no simple matter of replication. The Angel's genetic structure was incredibly complex, containing elements that the tech adepts struggled to fully understand. The most obvious of these was the wing structure that had marked Sanguinius as divine from his earliest days. While most Space Marines would not develop the full wings that their Primarch possessed, traces of this genetic gift would manifest in other ways: enhanced agility, an instinctive understanding of three-dimensional combat, and a grace of movement that set them apart from their brother legions. They would become masters of assault warfare, striking from unexpected angles with a fluidity that seemed almost supernatural. Yet there were other aspects of Sanguinius's genetic legacy that proved more troubling. The same genetic factors that had given him his precognitive abilities and his resistance to the mutating effects of Baal's radiation had also created certain instabilities. Deep within the Angel's genetic code lay dormant sequences that the Emperor's gene rights could identify but not fully comprehend, patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm like a heartbeat waiting to quicken. The Emperor himself spent long hours studying these anomalies, his perfect intellect probing the mysteries hidden within his son's DNA. He found traces of something that should not have been there, genetic markers that spoke of deliberate tampering, of influences that had shaped Sanguinius's development during his time in the warp. The Chaos Gods had touched his son during that chaotic journey, from Terra to Baal, leaving their mark in ways both subtle and profound. Yet rather than seeing this as corruption, the Emperor recognized it as transformation. The dark influences that had sought to claim Sanguinius had instead been transmuted into something noble, their destructive potential channeled into creativity and inspiration. Where chaos had intended to create a monster, the innate nobility of the Primarch's soul had forged something beautiful instead. The angel's perfection was not despite the darkness that had touched him, but because of his triumph over it. This understanding would prove crucial in the years to come, for the genetic instabilities within Sanguinius's legacy would manifest in his sons as well. The Blood Angels would be marked by their Primarch's nobility, but they would also carry within them the seeds of a terrible hunger, a thirst that could only be satisfied by the lifeblood of their enemies. This red thirst would become both their greatest weakness and, paradoxically, one of their greatest strengths, driving them to heights of martial fury that few other legions could match. As the first recruits from Baal underwent the transformation into Space Marines, Sanguinius watched with mixed emotions. These young men, drawn from the finest warriors of his unified realm, were being reborn as something greater than human, their bodies and minds enhanced beyond mortal limitations. Yet in their transformation, he saw an echo of his own isolation. They were becoming something apart from the people they had once been, elevated beyond normal human experience, just as he had always been. The Primarch threw himself into their training with characteristic dedication, personally overseeing every aspect of their development. He taught them not just the arts of war, but the principles of honor that had guided his rule of Baal. They would be warriors, yes, but they would also be protectors, guardians of human civilization, rather than mere instruments of destruction. In their hearts, they would carry the memory of what they fought to preserve, the hope and nobility that had lifted Baal from barbarism to greatness. When the Blood Angels' Legion was finally ready for deployment, it numbered among the smaller of the Astartes' forces, but what they lacked in size they more than made up for in quality. Each Marine had been personally selected by Sanguinius himself, chosen not just for physical prowess, but for strength of character. They were artists as well as warriors, poets as well as killers, men who understood that the purpose of war was ultimately to preserve peace. The Legion's first campaign would take them far from the crimson skies of Baal to a distant system where human colonists struggled against alien predators that had claimed their worlds for millennia. It was a fitting beginning for the Blood Angels, a chance to prove that their nobility was matched by their martial prowess. As their fleet prepared to depart the Baal system, Sanguinius stood once more upon the highest tower of his palace, his wings spread wide against the setting suns. Below him, the people of Baal gathered to bid farewell to their angel and his warriors. They sang the ancient songs of their people, melodies that spoke of heroes who ventured into the darkness to bring back the light. Yet there was sadness in their voices as well, for they knew that their beloved leader was departing on a journey from which he might never return. The visions that had shown Sanguinius his destiny had not been granted to them, and they could only trust that their angel's sacrifice would serve some greater purpose. Sanguinius felt the weight of their devotion like a physical presence, their love and trust settling upon his shoulders alongside the burden of destiny that he had carried since childhood. He raised his hand in blessing, his voice carrying across the assembled multitudes with the same supernatural clarity that had first marked him as divine. He spoke to them not of glory or conquest, but of the bonds that would forever link him to this red world beneath twin suns, promising that no matter how far the stars might carry him, Baal would always remain his home. The departure was witnessed by millions across the system, as the golden fleet that had brought the Emperor to Baal now prepared to carry the Angel and his sons into the wider galaxy. The Blood Angels took their place aboard vessels that bore their newly granted heraldry, the winged blood drop that would become one of the most recognized symbols in imperial iconography. Their armor gleamed crimson and gold, colors that honored both their Primarch's noble bearing and the red sands of their birthworld. As the fleet prepared to translate into warp space, Sanguinius took one final look at the world that had shaped him. From the observation deck of his flagship, the Red Tier, he could see the vast desert plains where he had first learned to fly, the mountain ranges where he had fought his earliest battles against the mutant hordes, the cities he had built from nothing more than determination and hope. Each landmark held a memory, each vista told a story of triumph over adversity. Yet the angel's eyes were not filled with regret as he gazed upon Baal's receding form. Instead, they blazed with purpose, for he understood that his true work was only beginning. The lessons he had learned on this harsh world, the importance of sacrifice, the power of inspiration, the delicate balance between strength and mercy, would now be tested on a galactic stage. The boy who had fallen from the stars as an infant was returning to those same stars as a general in humanity's greatest war. The Blood Angels' first taste of the Great Crusade came at the Battle of Cygnus 7, where a human colony had been overwhelmed by a Xenos species that the imperial catalogues would later classify as the Nephilim. These creatures were parasitic in nature, hollowing out their victims and using their bodies as crude vessels for their own alien consciousness. The colonists who had managed to escape spoke of entire cities transformed overnight, of loved ones who walked and talked but whose eyes held nothing human behind them. When the Blood Angels made planetfall, they found a world that seemed superficially normal. The cities stood intact, their architecture unmarked by obvious signs of battle. Traffic moved through the streets in orderly patterns, and from a distance one might have mistaken the scene for a thriving human settlement. Yet as the Space Marines advanced through the urban landscape, the true horror of the situation became apparent. The people they encountered were hollow shells, their bodies puppeted by alien intelligences that had learned to mimic human behavior but could not replicate human emotion. They moved with mechanical precision, spoke in voices devoid of warmth or personality, and when threatened, they attacked with the coordinated fury of a hive mind rather than the chaotic desperation of individual humans fighting for their lives. Sanguinius led his warriors through this nightmare landscape with grim determination, his psychic abilities allowing him to distinguish between the possessed and the few genuine survivors who still clung to life in hidden refuges throughout the city. The battle was unlike anything the Blood Angels had trained for. How do you fight an enemy that wears the faces of those you have sworn to protect? How do you show mercy to creatures that have already consumed everything merciful about their hosts? The answer came from their Primarch himself, who demonstrated the terrible necessity that sometimes faced those who would defend humanity. With surgical precision, the Blood Angels eliminated the possessed colonists, each death a small tragedy, but also an act of mercy that freed the stolen bodies from their alien captors. Sanguinius wept openly as he fought, his tears falling like rain upon a battlefield where every victory was also a defeat. The campaign lasted 17 days as the Blood Angels methodically cleared each district of the parasitic infestation. They developed new tactics for urban warfare, learning to fight in 3 dimensions as Sanguinius used his wings to strike from unexpected angles, while his sons coordinated their assaults with an artistry that spoke to their Primarch's influence. By the time the last Nephilim was destroyed, the Blood Angels had proven themselves as both warriors and protectors, earning the grudging respect of their brother legions. Yet the victory at Cygnus 7 came with a price that extended beyond the obvious casualties. Several of the Blood Angels had been exposed to the Nephilim's psychic emanations during the fighting, and in the aftermath of the battle, they began to display disturbing symptoms. They complained of an insatiable hunger that no amount of food could satisfy, a thirst that water could not quench. Their eyes took on a reddish cast, and they became increasingly aggressive in their interactions with both comrades and mortals. Sanguinius recognized the signs immediately, for he had seen them before in his own reflection during the dark nights of his youth on Baal. The red thirst that lay dormant in his genetic legacy was awakening in his sons, triggered by exposure to alien psychic influence and the stress of their first major campaign. The Primarch gathered the affected Marines in private, speaking to them with the understanding of one who had faced the same terrible hunger. He taught them the techniques he had developed over the years to control the thirst, meditation practices that calmed the savage impulses, focusing exercises that channeled their aggression into productive outlets, and most importantly, the philosophical framework that transformed their curse into a source of strength. The red thirst would always be with them, he explained, but it need not define them. Like all powerful forces, it could be mastered by those with sufficient will and wisdom. The affected Marines listened with the devotion of disciples receiving sacred teaching, for they understood that their Primarch was not merely instructing them in battlefield tactics, but sharing the deepest secrets of his own soul. In the years that followed, this moment would be remembered as the foundation of the Blood Angels' unique culture, the beginning of their transformation from simple warriors into something approaching warrior monks. Word of the Blood Angels' performance at Cygnus 7 spread throughout the expanding Great Crusade, carried by the remembrancers and iterators who accompanied the expeditionary fleets. The tale of the angel and his sons became the stuff of legend, inspiring countless recruitment drives across human-settled worlds. Young men from 100 different systems dreamed of earning the right to bear the winged blood drop upon their armour, to serve under a Primarch whose very presence seemed to embody the highest ideals of human civilization. Yet Sanguinius himself remained troubled by the visions that continued to plague his dreams. If anything, his exposure to the wider galaxy had made the prophetic images more vivid, more detailed in their terrible clarity. He saw a golden palace under siege, its walls crumbling beneath the assault of traitor forces. He saw brother fighting brother, the unity of the Great Crusade shattered by betrayal and ambition. Most disturbing of all, he saw his own death played out in excruciating detail, a final confrontation with a fallen brother whose very presence radiated malevolence and corruption. These visions came to him not as abstract possibilities, but as glimpses of an approaching certainty. Sanguinius possessed the gift of true prophecy, the ability to see the threads of fate as they wove themselves into the tapestry of future events. Yet this gift was also a curse, for it showed him truths that he was powerless to prevent, destinies that seemed carved in stone despite his desperate desire to change them. The Primarch shared his burden with few, understanding that knowledge of the coming catastrophe would serve no purpose save to spread despair among those who looked to him for leadership. Instead, he threw himself into the Great Crusade with renewed vigour, determined to accomplish as much as possible before the darkness claimed him. Every world brought into compliance, every human settlement rescued from alien predation, every act of heroism performed by his sons. All of these became precious beyond measure, achievements to be treasured in the face of approaching doom. As the decades passed and the Great Crusade pressed ever deeper into the galaxy, the Blood Angels' Legion grew in size and reputation. New recruits arrived from across human space, drawn by tales of the Angel's nobility and the unique brotherhood that existed within his ranks. The Legion developed its own distinct culture, one that prized artistic achievement alongside martial prowess, that valued individual heroism while maintaining perfect unit cohesion. The Blood Angels became known for their assault tactics, their ability to strike with devastating speed and precision before withdrawing to strike again from a different angle. They excelled at void warfare, their Primarch's aerial combat experience translating into an intuitive understanding of three-dimensional battle space that few other legions could match. Their boarding actions became legendary throughout the Imperial Navy, as squads of crimson armoured marines carved through enemy vessels with an elegance that bordered on the artistic. Yet it was not merely their combat effectiveness that set the Blood Angels apart from their brother legions. Under Sanguinius's guidance, they became patrons of human culture, establishing libraries and art galleries on every world they conquered, preserving the unique achievements of each civilization they encountered, rather than simply imposing imperial uniformity. They understood that the Great Crusade was not merely about military conquest, but about the preservation and elevation of human civilization in all its forms. This philosophical approach sometimes brought them into conflict with other legions who favoured more direct methods of achieving compliance. The Iron Warriors, in particular, viewed the Blood Angels' careful approach to cultural preservation as inefficient, arguing that the rapid establishment of imperial control was more important than maintaining local traditions. These disagreements remained civil during the early years of the Crusade, but they planted seeds of division that would bear bitter fruit in years to come. Sanguinius himself was deeply troubled by these philosophical differences among his brother Primarchs. In his private moments, he could see the patterns forming, the ideological fractures that would eventually tear the Great Crusade apart. Some of his brothers embraced the Emperor's vision with genuine understanding, seeing themselves as gardeners of human civilization. Others viewed it merely as an excuse for conquest, caring more for the glory of battle than the welfare of those they claimed to protect. The Angel tried to serve as a mediating influence among his brothers, using his natural charisma and diplomatic skills to bridge the growing gaps between different factions within the Primarch Brotherhood. He found allies in Vulcan of the Salamanders, who shared his concern for civilian welfare, and in Robert Guilliman of the Ultramarines, whose systematic approach to governance complemented Sanguinius's more intuitive leadership style. Yet he also sensed the growing darkness in others, the barely controlled rage of Angron, the bitter resentment of Perturabo, the increasing instability of Conrad Cursi. Most troubling of all was his relationship with Horus, the war master who had been chosen by the Emperor to lead the Great Crusade in his absence. Sanguinius loved Horus as a brother, respected him as a leader, and understood better than most the enormous pressures that came with supreme command. Yet his prophetic visions showed him glimpses of a future where that same beloved brother would become something monstrous, a champion of the very forces that the Great Crusade existed to oppose. The burden of this knowledge was almost unbearable. How could he look upon Horus's face, knowing what he would become? How could he participate in strategy sessions, knowing that the plans they made would eventually be turned against the very Imperium they were meant to serve? Yet Sanguinius also understood that his visions showed only one possible future, and that perhaps through his actions that terrible destiny might yet be averted. As the Great Crusade entered its second century, the Blood Angels found themselves at the forefront of some of the most challenging campaigns in Imperial history. They fought alongside the Lunar Wolves against the techno-barbarian kingdoms of the Gendan cluster, their combined assault tactics proving devastatingly effective against enemies who had never faced such coordinated attacks. They joined forces with the Imperial Fists in the Siege of Tetractis, where Sanguinius's ability to inspire desperate courage in mortal troops proved crucial in maintaining morale during the grinding months of urban warfare. Perhaps most significantly, they participated in the Ulanor Crusade alongside nearly a dozen other legions, the largest military operation in human history up to that point. The Greenskin Empire that had grown unchecked in the Ulanor system represented everything that the Great Crusade opposed, a violent, expansionist culture that existed solely to wage war against other species. The campaign to destroy it would require the combined might of multiple legions working in perfect coordination. Sanguinius commanded the aerial assault forces during the final battle for Ulanor Prime, leading hundreds of jump-pack-equipped marines in a devastating attack against the Greenskin strongholds. His wings carried him through storms of enemy fire as he personally duelled with the alien warlords, his sword and his very presence inspiring his sons to feats of heroism that would be remembered for millennia. When the last greenskin fortress fell, it was Sanguinius who planted the imperial banner upon its highest tower, the image captured by remembrancers and transmitted across the galaxy as a symbol of human triumph. Yet even in victory, the angel's thoughts were troubled by the visions that continued to haunt his dreams. The triumph at Ulanor was magnificent, but it was also one of the last moments of true unity among the Primarchs. Soon the bonds of brotherhood that had held them together would begin to strain and snap under pressures that none of them fully understood. The golden age of the Great Crusade was drawing to a close, and with it would come trials that would test every principle that Sanguinius held dear. The celebration following the Ulanor victory was a grand affair, with the Emperor himself present to honour the achievements of his sons and their legions. It was during this celebration that Horus was elevated to the rank of War Master, granted supreme command over all imperial military forces in the Emperor's absence. The decision was not unexpected. Horus had proven himself time and again as both a brilliant general and a capable administrator, yet Sanguinius felt a chill of foreboding as he watched his brother accept the honour. In his visions, this moment marked the beginning of the end, the first step on a path that would lead to unimaginable tragedy. Yet as he looked upon Horus's face, seeing there nothing but genuine dedication to the imperial cause, Sanguinius allowed himself to hope that perhaps the future could still be changed. Perhaps the darkness he had foreseen was not inevitable, but merely one possibility among many. Perhaps love and loyalty would prove stronger than the corruption that sought to claim his brother's soul. As the celebrations continued around him, Sanguinius withdrew to a quiet balcony overlooking the ruins of the greenskin capital. The twin moons of Ulanor cast their pale light across the battlefield where so many had died for the dream of human unity. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of his brother legions preparing for departure, readying themselves for new campaigns in distant systems. The Great Crusade would continue, carrying the light of human civilization to the darkest corners of the galaxy. Yet the Angel of Baal knew that the greatest battles still lay ahead, and that before the end he would be called upon to make a sacrifice that would echo through 10,000 years of imperial history. The visions had shown him his destiny with perfect clarity. He would fall, but in falling he would save something far more precious than his own life. The thought brought him neither fear nor regret, only a quiet determination to face whatever trials awaited him with the same nobility that had guided him since his earliest days beneath the crimson skies of his birth world. The years that followed Ulanor brought changes that few could have anticipated. The Emperor's withdrawal to Terra, ostensibly to pursue mysterious projects in the depths of the imperial palace, left a void that even Horus's appointment as War Master could not entirely fill. For the first time since the Great Crusade began, the Primarchs found themselves operating without their father's direct guidance, forced to interpret his vision through their own understanding and ambition. Sanguinius felt this absence more keenly than most, for his prophetic gifts had always resonated with the Emperor's own psychic presence. Without that guiding light, his visions became more fragmented, more difficult to interpret. He saw glimpses of golden halls wreathed in flame, of a throne that demanded terrible sacrifice, of his father locked in battles that transcended the merely physical. Yet the meaning of these images remained frustratingly elusive, like trying to grasp smoke with armoured fingers. The Blood Angels continued their campaigns across the galaxy, bringing world after world into imperial compliance with their characteristic blend of martial prowess and cultural sensitivity. They liberated the mining colonies of the Gehenna Reach from a Xenos species that had enslaved the human population for generations, fought alongside the Raven Guard in the shadowy campaigns of the Perdition cluster, and joined the Iron Hands in crushing a rebellious techno-cult that had declared independence from imperial authority. Each victory added to the Legion's growing reputation, but Sanguinius found himself increasingly troubled by the methods employed by some of his brother legions. Reports reached him of worlds left depopulated by the World Eaters, of civilian populations subjected to calculated terror by the Night Lords, of ancient cultures erased without thought by commanders who valued efficiency above all else. These were not the actions of liberators, but of conquerors, and they spoke to a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Great Crusade was meant to achieve. The Angel attempted to address these concerns through private communications with his brothers, carefully worded messages that expressed his philosophical differences without openly challenging their authority. Some, like Vulcan and Corvus Corax, shared his misgivings and worked to moderate their own forces' actions. Others dismissed his concerns as the naive idealism of one who had never faced truly desperate circumstances. A few, most notably Angron and Conrad Kurz, responded with barely concealed hostility, viewing his criticism as an attack on their very nature. It was during this period of growing tension that Sanguinius received word of a discovery that would profoundly impact both his legion and his understanding of his own nature. Deep in the archives of a conquered world, Blood Angel scholars had uncovered ancient texts that spoke of creatures remarkably similar to the mutant blood drinkers that had once plagued Baal. These documents, dating back to the dark age of technology, described entities that fed on human life force and possessed an uncanny ability to spread their condition to others through blood contact. The implications were staggering. The creatures that Sanguinius had spent his youth fighting were not unique to Baal, but part of a larger pattern that stretched across human space and deep into history. Moreover, the texts contained detailed descriptions of genetic markers and behavioral patterns that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the red thirst that afflicted his own sons. The possibility that his legion carried within them the seeds of the very corruption he had dedicated his life to fighting was almost too terrible to contemplate. Sanguinius ordered the immediate and absolute classification of these discoveries, sharing the knowledge only with his most trusted advisors and the Legion's senior apothecaries. If word of this potential instability spread beyond the Blood Angels, it could provide ammunition for those who already questioned the loyalty of the legions to their human origins. Worse still, it might lead to the dissolution of his legion entirely, robbing humanity of one of its most effective fighting forces at a time when unity was more crucial than ever. The Primarch threw himself into understanding the nature of this genetic legacy, working alongside the Legion's medical staff to develop new screening procedures and treatment protocols. They discovered that the red thirst manifested differently in different individuals. Some experienced it as a mild increase in aggression during combat, others as an overwhelming compulsion that could drive them to acts of savagery if not carefully controlled. The key seemed to lie in early identification and proper mental conditioning, techniques that built upon the philosophical training that Sanguinius had always emphasized within his legion. Yet even as they developed methods to manage the red thirst, disturbing reports began to reach the Angel from across the galaxy. Other legions were experiencing their own forms of genetic instability. The Thousand Sons suffered from an epidemic of mutation that threatened to consume the entire legion, while the Space Wolves displayed an increasing tendency toward bestial behavior that worried even their own officers. It seemed that the gene seed technology that had created the Astartes was not as perfect as originally believed, carrying within it flaws that manifested under the stresses of constant warfare. These revelations coincided with increasingly troubling reports from the edge of Imperial space, where expeditionary fleets encountered phenomena that defied rational explanation. Ships disappeared without trace in regions where the warp seemed unusually turbulent. Worlds were found stripped of all life, their populations vanished without any sign of struggle or alien intervention. Most disturbing of all were the reports of possessed individuals, humans whose behaviour suggested that their bodies had been taken over by entities of pure malevolence. Sanguinius recognised these signs from his studies of Baal's ancient history and his own encounters with warp-spawned corruption. The forces of chaos, long thought to be mere superstition by the imperial truth, were stirring in the depths of the immaterium. Whether this was a response to humanity's expansion across the galaxy or the result of some cosmic cycle beyond mortal understanding, the implications were clear. The Great Crusade faced enemies far more dangerous than any Xenos species or rebellious human faction. The Angel attempted to bring these concerns to the attention of his brother Primarchs, but found his warnings met with skepticism or outright dismissal. The imperial truth had taught them that such supernatural threats were merely primitive superstitions, the products of ignorant minds seeking to explain natural phenomena through mystical means. Even those Primarchs who possessed psychic abilities, like Magnus the Red, viewed the warp as a tool to be mastered rather than a realm of genuine spiritual danger. Only a few shared Sanguinius's growing alarm. Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands had encountered similar phenomena during his campaigns in the galactic north and had drawn similar conclusions about their nature. Rogel Dawn, ever practical in his approach to warfare, recognized that whether these threats were supernatural or merely poorly understood, they required new tactical approaches to counter effectively. Most surprisingly, Mortarion of the Death Guard, despite his well-known hatred of psychic phenomena, admitted to having witnessed events that challenged his understanding of the universe's fundamental nature. As the Great Crusade entered its 3rd century, these underlying tensions began to manifest in more obvious ways. The Council of Nicaea, convened to address the growing controversy over psychic powers within the legions, became a bitter confrontation between different philosophical approaches to warfare and governance. Sanguinius found himself caught between the extremes, sympathetic to Magnus's arguments for the controlled use of psychic abilities while understanding the concerns of those who viewed such powers as inherently dangerous. The Angel's own testimony before the council was a masterpiece of diplomatic reasoning, acknowledging the legitimate fears surrounding psychic phenomena, while arguing for a measured approach that neither embraced them uncritically nor rejected them entirely. He spoke of his own experiences with prescient visions, describing how they had enabled him to save countless lives, while also acknowledging the burden they placed upon those who possessed such gifts. His words carried weight not only because of his reputation for wisdom, but because he embodied the very synthesis of nobility and power that the Astartes were meant to represent. Yet even Sanguinius's eloquence could not bridge the fundamental divide that had opened among the Primarchs. The Emperor's final ruling, which banned the use of psychic powers within the legions, satisfied no one completely and left deep resentments that would fester in the years to come. Magnus withdrew into sullen isolation, convinced that his father had rejected not just his methods, but his very nature. The Space Wolves and other anti-Psyker factions viewed the ruling as vindication, but remained suspicious of those legions that had argued for a more permissive approach. In the aftermath of Nicaea, Sanguinius found his visions becoming increasingly dark and specific. He saw the face of Horus twisted by corruption, his noble features transformed into something monstrous. He witnessed battles fought not against alien enemies, but between the very legions that had once stood united under the imperial banner. Most terrible of all, he saw his own death with perfect clarity, a final confrontation in golden halls where he would fall, defending principles that had guided him since his youth on Baal. These visions came to him with such frequency and intensity that they began to affect his ability to function in his daily duties. His equerries noticed that their Primarch often seemed distant during briefings. His attention focused on threats that existed only in potential futures. His sons within the Blood Angels detected the change in their Gene Father's demeanour, though none dared to question him directly about the source of his obvious distress. The breaking point came during the campaign against the Spider Nebula, where the Blood Angels encountered a Xenos species that possessed powerful psychic abilities despite the Nicaea prohibitions. Faced with enemies who could manipulate reality itself, the Legion found their conventional tactics woefully inadequate. Squads of Marines were torn apart by invisible forces, their armour providing no protection against attacks that bypassed physical defences entirely. Sanguinius made the difficult decision to deploy his own psychic abilities in direct violation of the Nicaea Edict, using his prescient gifts to anticipate enemy movements and his telepathic powers to coordinate his forces in ways that conventional communication could not achieve. The tactic proved devastatingly effective, allowing the Blood Angels to outmaneuver their psychically gifted opponents and achieve victory against seemingly impossible odds. Yet the victory came at a cost that extended far beyond the obvious casualties. Word of Sanguinius's use of banned abilities spread throughout the Crusade fleets, carried by remembrancers and itinerators who had witnessed the battle. Some praised the Angel for his pragmatic approach to an impossible situation, arguing that rigid adherence to doctrine in the face of extinction served no useful purpose. Others condemned him for setting a precedent that could undermine the entire foundation of imperial authority. The criticism stung Sanguinius more deeply than any physical wound he had ever received. Throughout his existence, he had prided himself on being a model of imperial virtue, someone whose actions could serve as an example for others to follow. The thought that his decision might encourage other Primarchs to disregard imperial edicts filled him with guilt and self-doubt. Yet he also knew that he had saved the lives of thousands of his sons, and that any other choice would have resulted in the complete destruction of his expeditionary force. The incident marked a turning point in Sanguinius's relationship with the broader Imperium. No longer could he view himself as simply a loyal son carrying out his father's will. He had become a leader forced to make choices between competing loyalties, between the letter of imperial law and the welfare of those under his command. The realization was both liberating and terrifying, for it meant accepting responsibility for decisions that could affect the fate of entire worlds. As reports of similar incidents began to filter in from across the galaxy, it became clear that the Spider Nebula campaign was merely one example of a larger pattern. Primarchs throughout the Crusade were finding themselves forced to choose between rigid adherence to doctrine and the practical necessities of warfare. Some, like Guilliman and Dawn, managed to navigate these challenges while maintaining their loyalty to imperial authority. Others began to drift away from their father's vision, convinced that they understood the galaxy's needs better than distant bureaucrats on Terra. The stage was being set for the greatest tragedy in human history, though few recognized the signs for what they were. The bonds of brotherhood that had held the Primarchs together were beginning to strain under the weight of competing philosophies and personal ambitions. The unity that had made the Great Crusade possible was fracturing along lines that had been present from the beginning, but had been hidden beneath the shared purpose of conquest and expansion. Sanguinius watched these developments with growing horror, his prophetic visions showing him glimpses of the catastrophe that was approaching. He saw brother fighting brother, legions that had once stood united, tearing each other apart in battles that would dwarf even the greatest campaigns of the Crusade. He witnessed the destruction of everything that the Imperium had built, the reduction of human civilization to a shadow of its former glory. Yet for all his prescient gifts, the Angel found himself powerless to prevent the approaching disaster. The forces that were driving the Imperium towards civil war were too vast, too deeply rooted in the fundamental contradictions of the imperial project itself. The dream of human unity had always been built upon the suppression of human diversity, the imposition of a single vision upon countless different worlds and cultures. That such a system would eventually generate resistance was perhaps inevitable, but the scale of the coming conflict would exceed even the most pessimistic predictions. As the Blood Angels continued their campaigns across the galaxy, Sanguinius began to prepare his legion for the trials that lay ahead. He intensified their training in urban warfare and siege tactics, knowing that the coming conflict would be fought not in the open void, but in the very heart of human civilization. He expanded their cultural preservation programs, understanding that they might soon become the custodians of imperial ideals that would be forgotten by others in the madness of civil war. Most importantly, he began to share with his most trusted officers the philosophical principles that had guided his own development, the synthesis of strength and mercy that had enabled him to transform Baal from a wasteland into a thriving civilization. If he was destined to fall in the coming darkness, he was determined to ensure that his legacy would survive in the hearts and minds of his sons, a light that would continue to shine even in the deepest night. The first concrete signs of the approaching catastrophe came in the form of increasingly erratic behavior from Horus himself. The War Master, once the most charismatic and beloved of all the Primarchs, began to display a paranoia and aggression that alarmed those closest to him. His tactical briefings became exercises in barely controlled rage. His treatment of subordinates grew harsh and unpredictable, and his strategic decisions showed a recklessness that was completely at odds with his previous careful planning. Sanguinius attempted to reach out to his brother, arranging private meetings where they could speak without the pressure of their official duties. Yet he found Horus increasingly difficult to engage, his responses filled with bitter complaints about the Emperor's withdrawal and the impossible burden of leading the crusade without clear guidance. The War Master spoke of feeling abandoned, of being expected to achieve victory without being given the tools necessary for success. More disturbing still were the moments when Horus seemed to become someone else entirely, his familiar features taking on an expression of cold calculation that was utterly alien to his nature. During these episodes, he would speak of the Imperium's failures and limitations as if they were personal betrayals, his voice carrying an undertone of malice that sent chills down even Sanguinius's spine. When questioned about these statements later, Horus would claim no memory of making them, dismissing them as the products of stress and exhaustion. The Angel recognized these signs from his studies of corruption and possession, understanding that his brother was being influenced by forces that existed beyond the material realm. Yet any attempt to discuss these concerns was met with explosive anger, as Horus interpreted such suggestions as attacks on his competence and loyalty. The gulf between the brothers widened with each failed attempt at communication, until finally Sanguinius was forced to accept that the Horus he had known and loved was gone, replaced by something that wore his face, but served masters whose goals were antithetical to everything the Imperium represented. The final confirmation of his worst fears came in the form of a coded astropathic message from Istvan III, transmitted by loyalist elements within the Sons of Horus Legion. The message spoke of virus bombings and betrayal, of loyal space marines murdered by their own brothers on the orders of their Primarch. The scale of the treachery was almost impossible to comprehend. Entire companies of Astartes slaughtered not by alien enemies, but by those who had sworn the same oaths of loyalty to the Emperor. As similar reports began to filter in from across the galaxy, the full scope of Horus's rebellion became clear. 4 legions had turned traitor, their Primarchs seduced by promises of power that came from sources the imperial truth insisted did not exist. Worse still, intelligence suggested that other legions were wavering in their loyalty, their commanders torn between personal bonds to their brothers and their duty to the Emperor. The galaxy stood poised on the brink of a civil war that would dwarf every conflict in human history, a fratricidal struggle that would consume countless worlds and reduce the dream of imperial unity to ashes. Yet even as he contemplated the magnitude of the approaching catastrophe, Sanguinius felt a strange sense of relief. The waiting was finally over. The visions that had haunted his dreams for decades were about to become reality. Now at last, he could stop trying to prevent the inevitable and focus on ensuring that something worthy would survive the coming storm. The Angel of Baal spread his magnificent wings one final time as he gazed out at the stars, knowing that his greatest trial lay ahead, and that in facing it, he would discover the true meaning of the sacrifice that had always been his destiny. The loyalist response to Horus's betrayal came swiftly, yet even in their righteous fury, the remaining faithful Primarchs found themselves facing an enemy who knew their every weakness, their every tactical preference. These were not alien invaders or rebellious human populations, but their own brothers, warriors who had fought alongside them for decades and understood their methods with intimate precision. The civil war that erupted across the galaxy would test not just military might, but the very foundations of loyalty and brotherhood that had made the Great Crusade possible. Sanguinius found himself thrust into a position of leadership among the loyalist forces that went far beyond his official rank within the imperial hierarchy. While Rogel Dawn fortified Terra against the coming storm, and Robert Guilliman marshalled the distant Ultramarines, it was the Angel of Baal who became the spiritual heart of the resistance. His reputation for nobility and his gift for inspiring others made him a natural rallying point for those who refused to abandon their oaths to the Emperor. The Blood Angels' Legion, though smaller than some of their brother forces, possessed advantages that proved crucial in the opening phases of the conflict. Their experience with three-dimensional warfare translated perfectly to the void battles that characterized much of the early fighting, while their cultural emphasis on individual excellence produced warriors capable of operating independently when communications were disrupted by the chaos of civil war. More importantly, their philosophical training under Sanguinius's guidance had prepared them for the moral complexities of fighting former allies. The first major engagement of what would later be called the Horus Heresy saw the Blood Angels deployed alongside the Imperial Fists and Iron Hands in a desperate attempt to prevent the traitor forces from capturing the Forge Worlds of the Medusa sector. These ancient centres of technological production were crucial to the war effort, their manufacturers capable of producing everything from bolter ammunition to Titan-class war machines. If they fell to Horus, the Loyalists would find themselves fighting at an even greater disadvantage than they already faced. The campaign began with a series of lightning strikes against outlying industrial facilities, as both sides sought to deny resources to their enemies while securing them for their own forces. Sanguinius led these raids personally, his wings carrying him through the smoke and fire of burning factories, as his sons fought to extract vital manufacturing equipment before the traitors could claim it. The sight of the golden-winged Primarch descending from the heavens became a symbol of hope for the loyal workers who had found themselves caught in the middle of a war they barely understood. Yet it was during these early battles that Sanguinius first encountered the full horror of what his fallen brothers had become. The traitor forces he faced were not merely rebels seeking political independence, or warriors motivated by personal ambition. They had been transformed by their exposure to powers that existed beyond the material realm, their minds and bodies corrupted by influences that the imperial truth had insisted were merely superstition. The first time he faced Fulgrim in single combat, high above the burning ruins of Forge Complex Gamma 7, Sanguinius barely recognized the being that had once been his brother. The Primarch of the Emperor's children had become something obscene, his perfect features twisted into an expression of manic glee as he wielded weapons that screamed with their own malevolent intelligence. The duel that followed was unlike anything in Sanguinius's previous experience, a battle not just of physical prowess, but of spiritual endurance against corruption that sought to claim his very soul. Fulgrim fought with a speed and grace that exceeded even his previous superhuman abilities, his movements accompanied by phantom sounds that seemed to emanate from the air itself. His blade, a weapon that had once been a masterwork of imperial craftsmanship, now pulsed with energies that made reality itself seem unstable in its presence. Each strike was accompanied by whispered promises of power and pleasure, temptations that sought to exploit any weakness in Sanguinius's noble heart. The angel met these attacks with a purity of purpose that burned like a flame in the darkness, his own sword blazing with the inner light that had always marked him as something divine. Where Fulgrim's corruption sought to seduce and overwhelm, Sanguinius responded with the disciplined fury of one who fought not for personal glory, but for the protection of all he held dear. Their battle raged across the Manufactorum's upper levels, leaving trails of devastation that would take decades to repair. In the end, it was not superior skill that decided the contest, but the fundamental difference in their natures. Fulgrim, for all his enhanced abilities, fought only for himself and the Dark Masters he had chosen to serve. Sanguinius drew strength from every life he sought to protect, every ideal he refused to abandon, every moment of beauty and nobility that the Imperium had made possible. When the fallen Primarch finally retreated, it was not because he had been defeated in conventional terms, but because he could not endure prolonged exposure to such concentrated purity. The encounter left Sanguinius deeply shaken, not by any physical injury, but by the realization of how completely his brother had been transformed. This was not the temporary madness of battle or the corruption of political ambition, but a fundamental alteration of everything that had once made Fulgrim who he was. The implications were staggering. If one Primarch could be so thoroughly changed, what hope was there for any of them? What guarantee did Sanguinius have that he himself might not eventually succumb to similar influences? These doubts were compounded by the reports that reached him from other theatres of the conflict. Ferrus Manus had fallen at Istvan Fair, his head taken as a trophy by the very brother he had tried to save. The Iron Hand's Legion had been all but destroyed in the massacre that followed, their survivors scattered across the galaxy like fragments of a shattered blade. Worse still, intelligence suggested that the traitor forces were actively seeking to corrupt rather than simply destroy their enemies, turning captured loyalists into willing servants of their dark cause. The psychological warfare employed by the traitor forces was perhaps more devastating than their conventional military attacks. They broadcast messages across all Imperial communication networks, spreading doubt and despair among the loyal forces. These transmissions featured former heroes of the Great Crusade, speaking of the Emperor's failures and the futility of resistance, their words carrying the weight of personal experience and intimate knowledge of Imperial weaknesses. Some of these propaganda efforts targeted Sanguinius specifically, playing upon his well-known compassion and his tendency to blame himself for failures beyond his control. Recordings purporting to show blood angels who had joined the traitor cause spoke of their liberation from the burden of impossible ideals, of the relief they had found in abandoning the pretense of nobility for the honest pursuit of power. Whether these messages were genuine or sophisticated fabrications mattered less than their psychological impact on those who heard them. The angel responded to these attacks in the only way he knew how, by being even more exemplary in his conduct, even more dedicated to the principles he claimed to represent. He made a point of visiting every unit under his command, speaking personally with officers and enlisted men alike, sharing their dangers and their hardships rather than commanding from the safety of a distant headquarters. His presence on the front lines became legendary, inspiring countless acts of heroism among troops who might otherwise have succumbed to despair. Yet this approach came with its own costs. Sanguinius pushed himself beyond the limits of even Primarch endurance, fighting battles across multiple star systems, while simultaneously managing the complex logistics of a war effort that spanned half the galaxy. His closest advisors watched with growing concern as their Gene-Father drove himself toward what seemed like inevitable breakdown, refusing all suggestions that he delegate more responsibilities to his subordinates. The breaking point came during the Siege of Cygnus Prime, a campaign that would test every aspect of Sanguinius's nature and reveal the true depth of the corruption that threatened to consume the galaxy. The world itself was a former shrine world, its population devoted to the worship of the Emperor in his aspect as the divine protector of humanity. When traitor forces seized control of the planet, they did not simply establish military control. They perverted every sacred site, turning temples into blasphemous monuments to powers that existed in opposition to everything the Imperium represented. The liberation of Cygnus Prime required not just military victory, but spiritual cleansing, the restoration of sanctity to places that had been deliberately defiled. Sanguinius understood that this campaign would be fought as much in the realm of faith and symbolism as on any physical battlefield. The sight of the angel liberating the Emperor's temples would carry meaning far beyond any tactical advantage, serving as proof that the forces of corruption could be defeated and that the imperial cause remained righteous. The traitor defenders were not content to simply resist the loyalist assault. They sought to corrupt the very process of liberation itself. They had prepared the planet as a vast trap, not just for Sanguinius's forces, but for Sanguinius himself. Every step of the campaign was designed to test the angel's moral resolve, to force him into choices that would compromise his principles or cost the lives of those he sought to protect. The first test came when the Blood Angels discovered that the traitors had herded the planet's civilian population into the very temples they sought to liberate. Any assault on these positions would inevitably result in massive civilian casualties, while avoiding them would allow the enemy to maintain strategic strongholds throughout the campaign. Traditional military doctrine suggested bypassing these positions and accepting the tactical disadvantage, but Sanguinius knew that such a decision would be interpreted as abandonment by the very people he had come to save. The solution he devised required a level of precision and coordination that pushed the Blood Angels to the very limits of their capabilities. Using his own prescient abilities to map out the exact positions of civilians within each complex, Sanguinius led surgical strikes that neutralized the traitor defenders while minimizing harm to their hostages. The operations required the Angel to place himself in extreme personal danger, using his wings to carry him through defensive fire that would have shredded any other target. Time and again, Sanguinius threw himself into situations where his survival depended not just on his superhuman abilities but on the devotion of his sons, who fought with desperate fury to protect their gene father from the consequences of his own nobility. The Blood Angels learned to anticipate their Primarchs' selfless impulses, positioning themselves to provide covering fire and extraction support for operations that no reasonable military commander would have attempted. The campaign reached its climax when Sanguinius faced the source of the corruption that had claimed Cygnus Prime, a greater demon that had taken residence in the planet's primary cathedral. This entity, a creature of pure malevolence that existed only to spread suffering and despair, had been feeding on the anguish of the world's population for months. Its very presence had twisted the fabric of reality around the cathedral, creating a zone where the normal laws of physics held only tenuous sway. The confrontation that followed was less a battle than a trial by ordeal, as Sanguinius found himself fighting not just against the daemon's physical manifestation, but against the psychic assault it launched against his mind and soul. The creature sought to exploit every doubt, every moment of guilt or uncertainty that the angel had ever experienced. It showed him visions of futures where his nobility led to greater suffering, where his refusal to embrace pragmatic brutality resulted in the deaths of countless innocents. Yet where these attacks might have broken a lesser being, they only strengthened Sanguinius's resolve. Each vision of potential failure reminded him of why his principles mattered. Each moment of despair was answered by a corresponding surge of determination. The demon found itself facing not just a powerful warrior, but a soul so pure that its very presence caused the creature physical pain, like a flame exposed to absolute darkness. The battle raged through dimensions of reality that mortal minds could barely comprehend, with Sanguinius drawing upon reserves of spiritual strength that he had never known he possessed. His wings blazed with inner light as he struck again and again at the demon's essence, each blow driven by the accumulated weight of every life he had sworn to protect. When the creature finally dissipated back into the warp, its destruction sent shockwaves through the immaterial realm that were felt by psykers across the sector. The liberation of Cygnus Prime marked a turning point in the wider conflict, proving that the forces of corruption could be defeated through a combination of military might and spiritual purity. Yet the victory came at a cost that extended far beyond the obvious casualties. Several blood angels had been exposed to the demon's influence during the final battle, and while they had resisted its attempts at corruption, the experience had awakened something within them that their gene father recognized with growing alarm. The red thirst that had always lurked within the blood angel's genetic structure began to manifest more frequently and more intensely among those who had participated in the Cygnus campaign. These warriors spoke of an overwhelming hunger that no amount of food could satisfy, a craving that could only be temporarily assuaged by the spilling of enemy blood. Their eyes took on a reddish cast and their behaviour became increasingly aggressive, even toward their battle brothers. Sanguinius found himself facing a crisis that struck at the very heart of his identity as a leader and protector. The genetic flaw that he had spent decades learning to control was spreading through his legion like a plague, triggered by exposure to the very forces they fought against. Every victory against the traitors seemed to come with the cost of his sons becoming more like the monsters they opposed, a bitter irony that threatened to undermine everything he had worked to achieve. The Primarch's response to this crisis revealed the depth of his wisdom and the strength of his character. Rather than attempting to hide the problem or deny its existence, he gathered his affected sons and spoke to them with the honesty that had always characterized his leadership. He shared with them his own struggles with the red thirst, the techniques he had developed to control it, and most importantly, the philosophical framework that transformed it from a curse into a source of strength. The blood angels, who heard their gene father's words in those private gatherings, would later describe the experience as transformative, not because it cured their affliction, but because it gave them a context for understanding it. Sanguinius taught them that the hunger they felt was not a sign of corruption, but a test of their resolve, a challenge that would either strengthen their nobility or reveal its absence. Those who could master the thirst would become greater warriors and more compassionate leaders, while those who succumbed to it would serve as warnings to their brothers. This philosophical approach to the blood angel's genetic instability would become one of Sanguinius's greatest legacies, a synthesis of acceptance and resistance that allowed his sons to function despite carrying within them the seeds of their own potential downfall. The techniques he developed during this period would be passed down through generations of blood angels, forming the foundation of their unique culture and their remarkable ability to maintain their humanity despite the monstrous urges that plagued them. As the Horus Heresy entered its middle phase, with neither side able to claim decisive victory, the character of the conflict began to change in ways that reflected the fundamental differences between the loyalist and traitor philosophies. The forces loyal to the Emperor fought to preserve and protect, accepting tactical disadvantages rather than compromise their principles. The traitor legions, freed from such constraints, embraced increasingly brutal methods in their pursuit of victory. This philosophical divide manifested itself in countless ways across the theatres of war. Loyalist forces would go to extraordinary lengths to minimize civilian casualties, even when such efforts compromised their military effectiveness. Traitor armies showed no such restraint, using terror and atrocity as weapons in their own right. The contrast became so stark that many neutral worlds chose sides based not on political considerations, but on moral ones, aligning themselves with whichever force seemed more likely to preserve some semblance of civilized behavior. Sanguinius found himself increasingly called upon to serve not just as a military commander, but as a moral authority for the loyalist cause. His reputation for nobility made him a natural spokesman for the principles that the emperor's followers claimed to represent, while his tactical brilliance ensured that his words carried weight among commanders who might otherwise dismiss philosophical concerns as luxuries they could not afford. The Angel's influence extended beyond the military sphere to encompass the broader civilian response to the Civil War. His speeches, broadcast across imperial communication networks, became rallying points for resistance movements on traitor-held worlds. His image appeared on propaganda posters that emphasized the choice between corruption and purity, between the dark promises of chaos and the difficult path of righteousness that the Imperium represented. Yet this role, as a symbol of imperial virtue, came with burdens that weighed heavily on Sanguinius's soul. He understood that every word he spoke would be scrutinized for signs of weakness or doubt, that any failure on his part would be seized upon by enemy propagandists as proof of the loyalist cause's hypocrisy. The pressure to maintain perfect moral conduct at all times was exhausting, particularly when combined with the physical demands of leading one of the Imperium's most active military forces. The strain began to show in subtle ways that only those closest to the Primarch could detect. His normally immaculate appearance became slightly dishevelled as he pushed himself beyond the limits of endurance. His responses to tactical briefings, while still brilliant, occasionally carried an edge of irritation that was completely unlike his usual patient demeanour. Most concerning of all, his prescient visions became more frequent and more vivid, often causing him to pause mid-conversation as he experienced glimpses of futures that filled him with dread. These visions showed him scenes that he had witnessed countless times before: the golden halls of the imperial palace under siege, the face of Horus twisted by corruption, and his own death played out in excruciating detail. Yet now they came with additional context that made them even more disturbing. He saw the broader consequences of the choices that would be made in those final moments. The 10 millennia of darkness that would follow the heresy, regardless of which side ultimately claimed victory. The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable. Sanguinius understood that even if the loyalists succeeded in defeating Horus, the damage to the Imperium would be so severe that it would never recover its former glory. The golden age of the Great Crusade was ending forever, to be replaced by an era of stagnation and decline that would stretch across centuries. His own sacrifice, when it came, would preserve something precious but could not prevent the larger tragedy from unfolding. Despite these grim revelations, or perhaps because of them, Sanguinius threw himself into his duties with renewed determination. If the future could not be changed, then at least he could ensure that the present was lived with honour and dignity. Every battle became an opportunity to demonstrate the principles he held dear. Every victory a chance to prove that nobility was not weakness, but strength of the highest order. The Blood Angels, under his command, began to reflect this philosophy in their own conduct, becoming known throughout the loyalist forces for their combination of martial prowess and moral integrity. They fought with a precision and discipline that was unmatched by any other legion, yet they also showed a compassion for civilian populations that set them apart from many of their allies. Their reputation spread across the galaxy, inspiring recruitment drives that brought new volunteers to the loyalist cause. Yet even as his influence grew, Sanguinius found himself increasingly isolated by the very perfection that others admired in him. His brother Primarchs, while respecting his abilities and his character, sometimes found it difficult to relate to someone who seemed incapable of moral compromise. His own sons, devoted though they were, could not share the burden of prophetic knowledge that weighed so heavily upon his shoulders. The angel's loneliness was perhaps most acute during the quiet moments between battles, when he would stand alone on the observation decks of his flagship and gaze out at the stars. In those moments, he could feel the full weight of destiny pressing down upon him, the knowledge that every choice he made was leading inevitably toward the moment of his own destruction. Yet even in these dark hours, he found comfort in the certainty that his sacrifice would serve a purpose greater than his own existence. As the war entered its final phase, with traitor forces gathering for an assault on Terra itself, Sanguinius began to make the preparations that would define his ultimate legacy. He recorded private messages for key figures throughout the Imperium, words of wisdom and encouragement that would guide them through the dark years ahead. He ensured that the Blood Angel's cultural traditions and philosophical teachings were properly documented, creating a foundation that would allow his legion to maintain its identity long after his death. Most importantly, he began to prepare his sons for the reality of fighting without him. The angel had always led from the front, his presence serving as both inspiration and tactical advantage for the Blood Angels in combat. His death would leave a void that could never be filled, yet the Legion would need to continue functioning if it was to serve the Imperium in the millennia to come. The process was subtle, accomplished through gradual delegation of authority and the careful cultivation of leadership skills among his officers. Sanguinius began to step back from a direct tactical command in smaller engagements, allowing his subordinates to develop their own styles while he provided guidance and support. He established new traditions and protocols that would help maintain unit cohesion in the absence of his unifying presence. These preparations were noted by the more perceptive members of his inner circle, though none dared to question their Primarch directly about his apparent planning for a future without him. Instead, they threw themselves into their duties with renewed dedication, understanding on some instinctive level that their time with the angel was drawing to a close. The bonds between the Blood Angels grew stronger during this period, as if they were unconsciously preparing to support each other through the loss that awaited them. As Terra itself came under siege and the final act of the Horus Heresy began to unfold, Sanguinius found his visions becoming so vivid and immediate that the boundary between present and future began to blur. He could see the very moments approaching when he would be called upon to make the ultimate sacrifice, could feel the weight of the choices that would define not just his own fate, but the destiny of all humanity. Yet for all the darkness of these revelations, the Angel of Baal felt no fear, no regret for the path that had brought him to this point. He had lived a life of purpose and meaning, had touched countless souls with his nobility and his sacrifice. When the moment came to lay down his life in defense of all he held dear, he would do so gladly, knowing that his death would kindle a light that would shine through 10,000 years of imperial history. The golden-winged Primarch spread his magnificent wings one final time as he prepared for the battle that would determine the fate of humanity itself, ready to fulfill the destiny that had been written in the stars since the moment of his creation. The Siege of Terra began not with the thunder of orbital bombardment, but with a silence so profound that even the mighty walls of the imperial palace seemed to hold their breath. Across the Sol system, the largest fleet in human history had gathered, not in celebration of conquest, but in preparation for the most terrible fratricide the galaxy had ever witnessed. Ships that had once sailed together in brotherhood now faced each other across the void, their weapons trained upon vessels that bore the same human origin, the same imperial heraldry, yet served masters whose souls had been claimed by powers antithetical to everything the Imperium represented. Sanguinius stood upon the highest tower of the Eternity Gate, his wings folded against his back as he gazed upward at skies that had been turned the colour of dried blood by the atmospheric disturbance caused by so many ships transitioning from warp space. The sight filled him with a melancholy that went beyond simple sadness. It was the grief of one who witnesses the end of an age, the final collapse of dreams that had once seemed within reach of fulfillment. Below him, the preparations for siege continued with mechanical precision. Rogel Dawn's imperial fists had transformed the imperial palace into the most formidable fortress in human history, its walls bristling with defensive weapons that could level mountain ranges. Gun emplacements that had been designed to repel alien invasions now turned their barrels toward the sky, ready to face an enemy that shared their creator's genetic heritage, but had abandoned every principle that had guided their construction. The irony was not lost on the Angel of Baal. Here, upon the very world where humanity had first reached toward the stars, they would fight their greatest battle, not against alien oppressors or cosmic catastrophes, but against their own brothers and sons. The golden age of expansion and hope had died somewhere in the dark between the stars, replaced by an age of suspicion and fraternal warfare that would leave scars across the galaxy for millennia to come. Reports continued to flow in from across the system as traitor forces took position around Terra's outer defences. The names that appeared in these tactical assessments read like a roll call of heroes from the Great Crusade. Commanders who had once stood beside Sanguinius in victory, warriors whose courage had inspired countless acts of heroism, now corrupted beyond recognition by influences that transformed nobility into malice and honour into cruelty. Most painful of all were the reports concerning Horus himself. The War Master's flagship, the vengeful spirit, had taken position at the heart of the traitor fleet, like a cancerous growth at the centre of what had once been humanity's greatest achievement. Intelligence gathered by loyalist agents spoke of the vessel's transformation, its sacred halls perverted into shrines to powers that fed on suffering and despair. The ship that had once carried the Emperor's favourite son to countless victories now served as a conduit for forces that sought the complete destruction of everything he had once fought to protect. Sanguinius had requested permission to lead a boarding action against the vengeful spirit, to face his fallen brother in single combat and perhaps end the war through decisive action. The request had been denied by the Emperor himself, not from any doubt about the Angel's capabilities, but from knowledge of what such a confrontation would cost. The Master of Mankind understood, as perhaps only he could, that Sanguinius carried within himself something too precious to risk in a battle that might be won through other means. The first attacks came not from the sky but from below, as traitor forces that had infiltrated Terra's underground systems began to emerge in coordinated strikes across the planet's surface. These were not the massed assaults that had characterized the early phases of the Civil War, but surgical operations designed to sow confusion and terror among the civilian population. The message was clear: nowhere was safe, no sanctuary would be respected, and the very foundations of imperial authority were under attack. Sanguinius responded to these incursions with the swift deployment of Blood Angel's strike forces, their red and gold armour gleaming as they descended from the palace walls, like avenging angels made manifest. The sight of the Primarch leading these counterattacks in person, his wings carrying him through the smoke and fire of burning hab blocks, became a symbol of hope for Terra's embattled defenders. Where the Angel appeared, resistance stiffened, morale improved, and the seemingly impossible task of defending an entire world began to seem achievable. Yet with each engagement, Sanguinius felt the weight of prophecy pressing more heavily upon his shoulders. His visions had shown him these very battles, had revealed the tactical patterns that would emerge as the siege progressed. He fought not just against the enemies before him, but against the terrible knowledge of how each victory would ultimately prove insufficient, how each triumph would only delay the inevitable moment when everything would depend upon choices that had already been foreseen. The red thirst that had always lurked within the Blood Angel's genetic structure began to manifest more frequently as the siege intensified. The stress of constant combat, combined with the psychic emanations from the traitor forces, triggered the dormant instabilities that Sanguinius had spent decades learning to control. His sons fought with increasing ferocity, their disciplined tactics gradually giving way to a berserker fury that was both terrifying and effective. The Primarch watched this transformation with mixed emotions. The enhanced aggression made his warriors more effective in close combat, their natural advantages in melee fighting magnified by the blood rage that drove them to extraordinary feats of violence. Yet he also understood that each episode of the Red Thirst brought his sons closer to becoming the very monsters they fought against. Their nobility gradually eroded by exposure to influences that fed on anger and bloodshed. During the brief respites between attacks, Sanguinius gathered his most affected warriors and shared with them the meditation techniques he had developed during his youth on Baal. These sessions, conducted in the quiet sanctuaries deep within the imperial palace, became islands of peace in an ocean of violence. The angel spoke to his sons not as a commander issuing orders, but as a father sharing the wisdom born of his own struggles with the darkness that lived within their shared genetic legacy. The techniques were simple in concept, but demanding in execution. Breathing exercises that calmed the savage impulses, mental disciplines that channeled aggression into focused purpose, and philosophical frameworks that transformed the hunger for blood into a hunger for justice. Those blood angels who mastered these practices found that they could embrace the red thirst without being consumed by it, using its power while maintaining their essential humanity. Yet not all who attempted these disciplines succeeded in their application. Some blood angels, overwhelmed by the intensity of their transformation, had to be confined to prevent them from attacking their own battle brothers. Others disappeared entirely, vanishing into the labyrinthine depths of the palace where they could harm no one but themselves. Each such loss was a personal tragedy for Sanguinius, a reminder that his genetic legacy carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The siege reached a new level of intensity when the traitor forces began their assault on the palace's outer defences. The bombardment that preceded this attack was unlike anything witnessed in human history. Orbital weapons designed to crack planetary crusts turned their fury upon walls that had been built to withstand such punishment. The very air seemed to scream as energy beams and kinetic projectiles struck adamantium and ceramite barriers, each impact sending shockwaves through the earth that could be felt in the deepest bunkers. Sanguinius led the defence from the walls themselves, his presence serving as both tactical coordination and spiritual inspiration for the thousands of defenders who looked to him for guidance. His wings spread wide against the flame-lit sky. He became a figure of legend made manifest, proof that the forces of corruption had not yet claimed all that was noble in the galaxy. When sections of the wall came under concentrated fire, it was the angel who appeared to rally the defenders, his voice carrying above the din of battle with supernatural clarity. The traitor assault forces that finally breached the outer perimeter found themselves facing not demoralized defenders, but warriors inspired to heights of heroism by their gene father's example. Blood angels fought with a precision and fury that surprised even veteran traitor commanders. Their combat doctrine perfectly adapted to the close-quarters fighting that characterized siege warfare. Squad after squad of crimson-armored marines threw themselves into breaches in the walls, their sacrifice buying precious time for Dawn's engineers to establish secondary defensive positions. It was during one of these desperate holding actions that Sanguinius first encountered the full extent of what his fallen brothers had become. A breach in the wall near the Lion's Gate had been seized by a force of Emperor's children, their once perfect armour now decorated with obscene trophies and blasphemous symbols. At their head strode a figure that the angel recognised, despite the mutations that had transformed his features beyond easy recognition. The duel that followed was witnessed by thousands of defenders and attackers alike, a confrontation between two opposing philosophies made manifest in physical form. Where Sanguinius fought with the controlled fury of righteousness, his opponent embraced a chaotic savagery that sought to corrupt through contact, to spread its influence like a spiritual plague. Their weapons rang against each other with sounds that seemed to echo in dimensions beyond the merely physical, each clash sending ripples through the fabric of reality itself. The angel's victory, when it came, was achieved not through superior martial skill, but through the purity of his purpose. His opponent's corruption, for all its supernatural enhancement, could not stand against the concentrated nobility that Sanguinius embodied. When the fallen Astartes finally collapsed, his form began to dissolve back into the constituent elements from which it had been assembled, leaving behind only the fading echo of malevolent laughter. The sight of their champion's defeat sent shockwaves through the traitor assault force. Yet rather than retreating, they pressed their attack with even greater ferocity. It became clear that victory or defeat in conventional terms mattered less to them than the spreading of corruption and the infliction of suffering. They fought not to achieve tactical objectives, but to drag their enemies down to their own level of degradation, to prove that nobility and honour were mere illusions that would crumble when subjected to sufficient pressure. This revelation forced a fundamental change in loyalist defensive strategy. Traditional siege warfare assumed that attackers sought to capture territory or resources, objectives that could be denied through tactical withdrawal or scorched earth policies. Against enemies who valued corruption above conquest, such approaches were not merely ineffective, but actively counterproductive, creating opportunities for the very spiritual contamination they sought to prevent. Sanguinius found himself developing new tactical doctrines that prioritized the preservation of imperial ideals alongside mere physical survival. Blood Angels units began to incorporate ritual purification into their combat procedures, cleansing areas they had successfully defended to prevent lingering corruption from taking root. Wounded warriors underwent spiritual as well as medical treatment, their souls examined for signs of taint that might manifest in future battles. These innovations spread throughout the loyalist forces as other commanders recognized their effectiveness. What had begun as specifically Blood Angels adaptations evolved into general principles that would guide imperial military doctrine for millennia to come. The concept of spiritual warfare, of battles fought simultaneously in the material and immaterial realms, became an accepted part of imperial strategic thinking. Yet for all these tactical successes, Sanguinius could feel the tide of battle gradually turning against the defenders. The traitor forces seemed inexhaustible, their losses replaced by reinforcements that emerged from warp portals opened within the palace grounds themselves. Each victory came at a cost that the loyalists could ill afford, while their enemies appeared to grow stronger through the very act of inflicting suffering upon their opponents. The angel's prescient visions began to focus on a specific moment that approached with inexorable certainty: the final confrontation between the Emperor and Horus aboard the War Master's flagship. He saw the golden halls of the vengeful spirit transformed into a charnel house, their sacred decorations replaced by monuments to corruption and despair. He witnessed his own father's departure from the palace, leaving behind the defenders who had sacrificed so much in service to his cause. Most terrible of all, he saw his own role in these approaching events. The visions showed him standing before the arch-traitor himself, his wings spread in defiance as he faced an enemy whose very presence threatened to overwhelm his senses with waves of pure malevolence. He saw the moment of his death with perfect clarity, understood the price that would be demanded of him, and the purpose that his sacrifice would serve. The knowledge filled him not with fear, but with a strange sense of peace. Throughout his existence, Sanguinius had been driven by the desire to protect those who could not protect themselves, to serve as a shield between humanity and the forces that sought its destruction. Now, at last, he understood the ultimate expression of that purpose, a single moment of perfect sacrifice that would preserve something precious for generations, yet unborn. As the siege entered what intelligence suggested would be its final phase, Sanguinius began to make his own preparations for the role destiny had assigned him. He recorded messages for key figures throughout the Blood Angels Legion, words of guidance and encouragement that would help them maintain their identity in the dark years ahead. He established new traditions and protocols that would preserve the philosophical teachings he had developed, ensuring that his genetic sons would continue to struggle against the red thirst long after his death. Most importantly, he spent time with each of his senior officers, sharing with them not just tactical knowledge, but the deeper wisdom that had guided his leadership throughout the decades of war. These conversations, conducted in the quiet chambers deep within the palace, became the foundation of the Blood Angels' unique culture, the source of the traditions that would distinguish them from all other Space Marine chapters. The officers who participated in these sessions would later describe them as transformative experiences, moments when they glimpsed the true depth of their Primarchs' wisdom and understanding. Sanguinius spoke to them not just of military matters, but of the philosophical principles that should guide their actions, the balance between strength and mercy that had enabled him to transform Baal from a wasteland into a thriving civilization. When the final summons came, the call to join the Emperor in his teleportation assault upon the vengeful spirit, Sanguinius felt no surprise, only the quiet satisfaction of one who sees long-laid plans finally coming to fruition. He donned his armor for what he knew would be the last time, each piece blessed with oils and inscribed with prayers that had been passed down through generations of his sons. His sword, the blade that had tasted the blood of countless enemies of humanity, seemed to hum with anticipation as he secured it at his side. The angel's final act before departing the palace was to visit the memorial chamber where the names of fallen blood angels were inscribed in letters of gold upon walls of black marble. He stood before these monuments to sacrifice, understanding that his own name would soon join theirs, yet finding comfort in the knowledge that their deaths had served a purpose greater than individual existence. When he finally spread his wings and took flight toward the teleportation chamber, thousands of defenders watched his departure with emotions they could barely comprehend. They understood, on some instinctive level, that they were witnessing the end of an era, the departure of a figure whose like would never be seen again. Yet they also felt a strange sense of hope, as if the angel's willingness to face whatever awaited him proved that some things were indeed worth dying for. The golden halls of the vengeful spirit awaited, and with them the destiny that had been written in starlight since the moment of Sanguinius's creation. The Angel of Baal flew toward his fate with wings of pure light, ready to make the ultimate sacrifice in defense of all he held dear, knowing that his death would become the foundation upon which 10,000 years of imperial faith would stand. The teleportation chamber aboard the Imperial Palace hummed with energies that seemed to bend reality itself around their focal point. Ancient technologies, dating back to the dark age of technology, and enhanced by the Emperor's own divine understanding, prepared to pierce the barriers between ships locked in mortal combat. The very air crackled with potential as the translation matrices aligned, creating a bridge across the void that separated Terra's defenders from the heart of their enemy's power. Sanguinius stood motionless within the teleportation array, his magnificent wings folded against his back as he felt the familiar tingle of molecular displacement beginning to take hold. Around him, the Emperor's chosen strike force made their final preparations, Adeptus Custodes in their gleaming golden armor, Imperial Fists veterans whose scarred ceramite bore witness to months of desperate fighting, and select members of other loyal legions who had proven themselves worthy of this ultimate mission. Or the angel's enhanced senses could detect the subtle wrongness that permeated the warp energies surrounding their departure point. The very fabric of reality had been stained by the presence of the traitor fleet, its natural harmony disrupted by influences that sought to transform order into chaos. Each breath carried with it the taste of corruption, a reminder that they were venturing into territory that had been claimed by powers antithetical to everything human civilization represented. Yet Sanguinius felt no fear as the translation energies reached their crescendo. His prophetic visions had shown him this moment countless times, had prepared him for every sensation and sight that would greet him upon materialization. The uncertainty that might have plagued a lesser being was replaced by the calm certainty of one who understood his role in the great pattern of fate. He was exactly where he needed to be, approaching the moment for which his entire existence had been preparation. The sensation of teleportation was unlike anything experienced by mortal beings. A brief interval where consciousness existed without form, where the soul touched the raw stuff of creation before being reassembled in distant space. For those gifted with psychic sensitivity, the experience carried additional layers of meaning, glimpses of the vast forces that shaped reality from beyond the material realm. Sanguinius felt these currents flowing around him like cosmic winds, bearing whispers of futures yet to be determined. When the energies finally released their hold and the strike force materialized aboard the vengeful spirit, the angel's first sensation was one of profound sorrow. The corridors that had once echoed with the disciplined footsteps of loyal space marines now resonated with sounds that belonged in nightmares rather than aboard a vessel of the Imperial fleet. The very walls seemed to pulse with malevolent life, their surfaces decorated with trophies that spoke of atrocities committed against both enemies and former allies. The air itself had been transformed, thick with psychic emanations that sought to cloud the mind and corrupt the soul of any who breathed it. Lesser beings would have been overwhelmed within moments, their consciousness subsumed by influences that fed on doubt and despair. Even the custodes, enhanced beyond normal human limitations, moved with visible effort through an atmosphere that resisted their presence like a living thing. Sanguinius felt these corrupting influences washing over him in waves, each one seeking some crack in his spiritual armor through which it might penetrate and begin its work of degradation. Yet where they touched the purity of his purpose, they found nothing to grasp, no weakness to exploit. The angel's nobility burned like a flame in the darkness, its light pushing back the shadows that sought to engulf him. The strike force advanced through corridors that had been transformed into galleries of horror, their walls lined with monuments to victories that had cost the traitors their very humanity. Here hung the banners of loyal regiments that had been corrupted rather than destroyed, their sacred symbols perverted into blasphemous parodies of their original meaning. There stood statues carved from materials that had once been living beings, their features frozen in expressions of eternal agony. Each step deeper into the vessel revealed new depths of degradation, evidence of how completely the sons of Horus had abandoned everything that had once made them worthy of the name they bore. The angel's heart ached as he recognized weapons and armor that had once belonged to warriors he had fought beside, their sacred forms now twisted into shapes that hurt to look upon. This was not merely defeat or death, but transformation into something antithetical to their original nature. The resistance they encountered was unlike any conventional military opposition. The defenders who emerged from hidden alcoves and concealed passages moved with the coordination of a single organism, their individual identities subsumed into a collective consciousness that served masters whose very existence was an affront to natural law. They fought not to achieve tactical objectives, but to spread the corruption that had claimed them, each wound they inflicted carrying with it the potential for spiritual contamination. Combat aboard the vengeful spirit became an exercise in surgical precision, as the loyalist forces sought to eliminate their enemies, while avoiding the traps that had been woven into the very structure of the vessel. Corridors that appeared empty concealed ambush points, where reality itself had been weakened to permit incursions from the warp. Doorways that seemed to lead to tactical objectives instead opened onto chambers where the laws of physics held no sway. Sanguinius led the advance with the fluid grace that had made him legendary among the Primarchs, his wings carrying him through three-dimensional combat environments that would have challenged any other commander. His sword blazed with inner light as it carved through opposition that seemed to multiply even as it was destroyed, each fallen enemy replaced by manifestations that were less and more than the warriors they had once been. The deeper they penetrated into the vessel's heart, the more apparent it became that this was not merely a military operation, but a spiritual pilgrimage. The vengeful spirit had become a temple to powers that existed in opposition to everything the Imperium represented, its sacred halls transformed into shrines where suffering and despair were offered as worship to entities that fed on such emotions. The angel's prophetic gifts revealed glimpses of the battles being fought simultaneously in other parts of the vessel, showing him visions of his father confronting challenges that transcended the merely physical. The Emperor moved through these corrupted halls like a being of pure light, his very presence causing the darkness to recoil, yet even his immense power was tested by the concentrated malevolence that had taken root within what had once been humanity's greatest achievement. As they approached the vessel's command section, Sanguinius felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of starlight. His visions had shown him what awaited in the chambers ahead, had prepared him for the confrontation that would define not just his own fate, but the future of all human civilization. The moment for which his entire existence had been preparation was finally at hand. The final barrier between the strike force and their objective was not a door or wall, but a threshold of pure psychic energy, a barrier that existed as much in the realm of spirit as in physical space. To pass beyond it would require not just courage, but absolute purity of purpose, the kind of spiritual strength that could not be feigned or borrowed, but had to be earned through a lifetime of noble choices. One by one, members of the strike force found themselves unable to proceed, their advance halted by the recognition that they carried within themselves doubts or compromises that rendered them unworthy of what lay ahead. Even some of the custodies, those perfect guardians of the Emperor's person, discovered limitations they had never suspected in their own nature. Only the most pure could pass beyond this final test. Sanguinius felt the barrier's touch like the caress of a loved one, recognizing in him the nobility that had defined every moment of his existence since his discovery upon the red sands of Baal. Where others found judgment and rejection, he experienced only welcome, as if the very universe itself acknowledged his right to stand in the presence of ultimate evil without fear of corruption. Beyond the threshold lay chambers that defied description, spaces where the normal laws of physics had been suspended in favour of geometries that served purposes antithetical to human understanding. The air shimmered with possibilities that existed only in the realm of nightmare, while shadows moved with their own volition across surfaces that seemed to shift and flow like living tissue. At the heart of this maze of impossibility, Sanguinius's enhanced senses detected the presence he had come to find. The being that had once been Horus Heresy, the Emperor's most beloved son, now radiated a malevolence so pure and concentrated that it seemed to warp reality around itself. This was no longer the charismatic leader who had once inspired such devotion among his brothers, but something that wore his face while serving masters whose very existence was a wound in the fabric of creation. The angel spread his wings wide as he approached the final chamber, their white feathers catching what little light remained uncorrupted in this place of ultimate darkness. Each step forward required an act of will that would have shattered lesser beings, as the concentrated evil that lay ahead sought to overwhelm his senses with waves of pure malevolence. Yet Sanguinius pressed on, driven by the certain knowledge that this moment had been ordained since the first day of his existence. His visions had shown him the price that would be demanded, the sacrifice that would be required to preserve something precious for the generations yet to come. He walked toward his destiny with the calm certainty of one who had always known that some things were worth dying for. The chamber that housed the arch-traitor was a cathedral of corruption, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to contain entire universes of suffering. At its centre stood a throne, carved from materials that hurt to look upon, their surfaces crawling with symbols that conveyed meaning through pain rather than understanding. Upon this seat of ultimate blasphemy sat the being that had once been humanity's greatest hope, now transformed into its darkest nightmare. The confrontation that followed existed on levels that transcended mere physical combat. Two opposing philosophies made manifest in flesh faced each other across a space that seemed to contain all the darkness and light that had ever existed. Where Sanguinius embodied the nobility and sacrifice that represented humanity's highest aspirations, his opponent had become the very incarnation of corruption and despair. The angel's sword blazed with inner fire as he raised it in salute to an enemy who had once been his beloved brother, knowing that this gesture of respect would be the last link between what Horus had been and what he had become. In the moments that followed, two demigods would clash in a battle that would echo through 10 millennia of imperial history, its outcome determining whether hope or despair would guide humanity through the darkness ahead. As their weapons met for the first time, sending shockwaves through dimensions both physical and spiritual, Sanguinius felt a moment of perfect clarity. This was why he had been created, why he had been gifted with wings that lifted him above the red wastes of Baal, why he had been granted visions of futures, both glorious and terrible. His entire existence had been leading to this moment of ultimate sacrifice, when the Angel of Baal would give his life to preserve the light that would guide humanity through its darkest hour. The battle raged across the corrupted cathedral with an intensity that threatened to tear holes in reality itself, each clash between the combatants sending ripples through the warp that were felt by psychers across the galaxy. Yet even as he fought with every fibre of his being, Sanguinius knew that victory, in conventional terms, was not his purpose here. His role was not to defeat the arch-traitor, but to provide his father with the opportunity to do what was necessary, even if that opportunity could only be purchased with the angel's own life. When the moment finally came, when the corrupted blade found its mark, and Sanguinius felt his life beginning to ebb away, his final thoughts were not of regret or fear, but of gratitude. He had been given the privilege of serving something greater than himself, of making a difference that would endure long after his physical form had returned to dust. As his vision dimmed and his magnificent wings folded for the last time, the Angel of Baal smiled, knowing that his sacrifice had not been in vain. The light that had burned so brightly within him did not die with his body but spread outward, like ripples on a cosmic pond, touching the hearts of all who had ever been inspired by his example. Across the galaxy, blood angels felt their gene fathers passing like a physical blow, yet in their grief they also found strength, understanding that they carried within themselves a spark of the nobility that had defined his existence. In the millennia that would follow, Sanguinius would be remembered not just as a warrior or a leader, but as the embodiment of everything that made humanity worth preserving. His image would grace countless shrines and temples. His words would guide generations of those who sought to follow his example, and his sacrifice would serve as proof that even in the darkest times, the light of hope could never be completely extinguished. The Angel of Baal had fulfilled his destiny, transforming death itself into a victory that would endure until the very stars grew cold and the last human drew breath beneath alien skies. In giving his life to save his father and preserve the Imperium, Sanguinius had achieved the only immortality that truly mattered, a place in the hearts of those who understood that some ideals are worth any sacrifice to preserve. The echo of Sanguinius's final breath rippled through the immaterium like a stone cast into still water, its reverberations felt by every soul touched by his nobility throughout the long years of war. Upon Terra, as the siege raged with undiminished fury around the palace walls, a strange silence fell over the Blood Angels' positions. Not the silence of defeat, but the profound quiet that follows the completion of something sacred, something that transcends the mere mechanics of victory and loss. Captain Azkaellin, first captain of the Sanguinius Guard, felt the moment of his Gene Father's passing as a physical wound, a tearing in his very soul that left him gasping upon the ramparts where he led the defence of the Eternity Gate. Around him, his battle brothers continued their grim work of holding the line against wave after wave of traitor assault. Yet something fundamental had changed in the quality of their resistance. Where before they had fought with disciplined fury, now they battled with the desperate courage of those who understood that they carried the last flickering flame of something precious through an endless night. The red thirst that had plagued the Legion throughout the siege underwent a transformation in those moments following their Primarch's death. Rather than the mindless hunger that had threatened to consume them, the Blood Angels found themselves filled with a crystalline clarity of purpose that burned away doubt and fear like morning mist before the sun. They fought not as berserkers driven by genetic compulsion, but as knights errant carrying forward the ideals their father had embodied, each blow struck in remembrance of lessons learned beneath the crimson skies of Baal. Word of the angels' sacrifice spread through the loyalist forces with supernatural speed, carried not by vox transmissions or messenger servitors, but by the peculiar telepathic resonance that bound all of the Emperor's sons to their genetic legacy. From the highest towers of the palace to the deepest bunkers carved into Terra's bedrock, defenders who had never seen Sanguinius in person felt the weight of his loss as if they had known him since childhood. His death became a rallying cry that transformed desperation into determination, fear into fury directed against those who had stolen such nobility from the galaxy. The traitor forces, sensing the shift in their enemies' morale, pressed their attacks with renewed vigour, yet found themselves facing resistance unlike anything they had encountered throughout the long months of siege. The very walls seemed to sing with defiance, their ancient stones remembering the touch of hands that had built them not for conquest, but for protection. Every corridor became a shrine to sacrifice, every breach in the defences a monument to those who chose death before dishonour. In the depths of the palace where the Emperor's most trusted servants maintained their eternal vigil, the news of Sanguinius's fall was received with a grief that transcended normal human emotion. These men and women, enhanced beyond mortal limitations, and trained to view their own lives as expendable resources in service to a greater cause, found themselves weeping tears they had thought themselves incapable of shedding. The angel had been more than a military commander, or even a beloved leader. He had been proof that nobility could exist without naivety, that strength could be tempered with mercy without becoming weakness. Malcador the Sigillite, seated upon the golden throne in the Emperor's absence, felt the moment of Sanguinius's death as a supernova of pure light within the warp, a final burst of radiance that illuminated the darkness surrounding Terra's defenders before fading into memory. The ancient Psyker understood, perhaps better than any other, the magnitude of what had been lost and the significance of what had been preserved through that ultimate sacrifice. The angel's death had brought them something beyond mere time. It had provided an example that would inspire resistance to corruption for millennia to come. Throughout the galaxy, on worlds where the Blood Angels had fought during the long years of the Great Crusade and the bitter civil war that followed, populations who had never known the Primarch's name felt an inexplicable sense of loss, as if some fundamental constant of the universe had been altered. Children born under alien suns wept without understanding why, while elderly men and women who had lived through the darkest days of old night found themselves remembering stories their grandparents had told of angels who descended from the heavens to protect the innocent. The legion that bore his genetic legacy underwent changes that would define their character for 10,000 years to come. The red thirst that had threatened to consume them was not eliminated by their Primarch's death, but transformed into something that could be channeled and controlled through disciplines that honoured his memory. They developed rituals of remembrance that turned their genetic curse into a source of strength, meditation practices that allowed them to commune with the nobility their father had embodied while maintaining their grip on sanity and purpose. These blood angels who survived the siege would become the foundation upon which future generations would build, carrying within their hearts not just the genetic legacy of their Primarch, but the philosophical framework he had created for transcending the limitations of their flawed nature. They learned to see the red thirst not as a mark of corruption, but as a test of character, a constant reminder that the greatest battles were fought not against external enemies, but against the darkness that existed within every soul. As news of the Emperor's victory aboard the vengeful spirit reached Terra's defenders, it came tinged with the bittersweet knowledge of what that triumph had cost. Horus was dead, his rebellion broken, the threat of galactic civil war finally ended. Yet the price paid for these achievements could never be fully calculated. The golden age of the Great Crusade was over, replaced by an era of caution and consolidation that would stretch across millennia. The dream of human unity among the stars had been preserved, but scarred in ways that would never fully heal. In the years that followed, as the Imperium slowly rebuilt from the devastation of civil war, the story of Sanguinius' sacrifice became a cornerstone of imperial faith. His image appeared in countless shrines and temples, his words were studied by scholars and soldiers alike, and his example inspired generations of those who sought to serve something greater than their own ambitions. The Angel of Baal had achieved in death what few could accomplish in life. He had become a symbol of humanity's highest aspirations, proof that even in a universe filled with horror and corruption, nobility and sacrifice could still triumph. The Blood Angels Legion, renamed as a chapter in accordance with the new Codex Astartes, would carry forward their Primarch's legacy through 10 millennia of warfare and vigilance. They would face threats that would have broken lesser warriors, defend worlds whose names would be forgotten by history, and stand as guardians of ideals that seemed increasingly fragile in an age of perpetual war. Yet through it all, they would remember the lessons learned beneath the twin sons of Baal, the wisdom of a father who had shown them that true strength came not from the absence of weakness, but from the courage to transcend it. The red sands of Baal Secundus, where it all began, would continue to produce warriors, worthy of their angelic heritage. Each new recruit would learn the story of their Primarch's life and death, would study the philosophical principles he had developed, and would take their place in a brotherhood that stretched back to those first desperate days when a golden-winged infant had fallen from the stars to transform a wasteland into hope itself. And in the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, where the most sacred relics of humanity's greatest heroes were preserved for all time, a single white feather rested in a case of crystal and adamantium. Taken from Sanguinius's wing after his final battle, it remained as pristine as the day he first spread those magnificent appendages above the red deserts of his birth world. Sometimes those few privileged to view this relic reported it seemed to glow with its own inner light, as if the nobility that had defined the angel's existence had crystallized into something that could never be destroyed, never be corrupted, never be forgotten. The galaxy was darker for his passing, yet brighter for his having lived. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, not the defeat of enemies or the conquest of worlds, but the proof that in a universe that seemed designed to crush hope, one being could shine so brightly that his light would continue to illuminate the path forward long after his physical form had returned to dust. Sanguinius, the Angel of Baal, had earned his place among the stars not through the power of his wings, but through the nobility of his heart. The great angel's story was complete, yet his legacy would endure until the last star burned cold in the endless night of eternity.